So today I'm just going to go over really simply, I know lots of my videos go into the 30 minutes and I'll try not to babble today. I'm just going to go over really simply how to debug JavaScript with HTML for this course. So this doesn't have anything to do with graphics. We're just making a simple little web page today and we're going to debug it. So first what we'll do is we'll use a Python server to just host this locally. And let me just open up a Chrome window and maybe resize this a little bit. So now if we go to localhost on 8000, we get our little website popping up here. So first things first, to just kind of notice, don't worry about all this scary stuff. We're basically just bringing in a style sheet to make it look all fancy, and that's why it looks like that. This is a bit of an important bit. We're actually going to bring in, if we look in our files, we have an index.js. We're going to bring that file in and it's going to run. So that's our JavaScript file, and we can take a look at that in a second. Next, I just wanted to show you we have this data.json. So in this course, you'll be working with JSON data quite a bit. So I just wanted to make kind of a simple example, like here's me, here's my job, here's my, I only have one pet, but we have an array of pets. And here's Tom Cruise because he's the first celebrity that popped into my head. There's a website I found. I don't know if it's actually his or not. I'm not sure if he has any pets, so he has an empty array, and his occupation is obviously an actor. So if we look at the JavaScript, don't be too scared about what's going on here. It's not this whole lesson today isn't about what this JavaScript is doing. It's more so we're going to make changes to the data and then try and debug it ourselves. So when the window loads, we tell it, hey, we want a console log out that we've loaded, and then we want to call our main function. Again, don't worry about what's happening here, but we're going to load in the data using this load function, which just goes and gets everything that's inside of this file, and then it returns it to us in a nice way. So we get loaded data, and right here we're taking that loaded data, we're doing basically a for each loop on it, and for each of those we're calling create profile. And create profile is just creating this bunch of HTML, and that's why we see this fancy looking stuff. But what I wanted to show you today was what happens when the data doesn't look exactly like we expect it to look like. So in this case, everything's working, it looks great. So to start, I wanted to first show you the developer tools. So if we go Control-Shift-I, or I believe actually if you just go like this and you go to more tools, developer tools, there we go. So if we go like this, we can see the console first thing first. So when we refresh the page, you'll see that this keeps on printing out to the console. This is very similar to something like Python where we go print, or C where we go printf. So if we look at, we can see the line number. So if we look at line 30, then we can actually go to line 30 and we can see that inside this function we're actually logging out the user. And there's that loaded that we expected because we're logging out up here. So now what's kind of interesting is if you're really lazy like me, and lots of people will give you kind of shit for doing this, but lots of developers will console log this is a message. So what they'll do is a lot of developers will console log things to see what's actually happening in their application. So for example, if we wanted to see what's happening with this data, we could, let me get rid of this one because it's not really making sense, but if we console log the loaded data and then we refresh it, we can see, sometimes we need to, and this is another trick. So if you're doing web development and you notice that it's not printing where we thought we'd print, or something hasn't changed that we thought would change, press and hold this refresh and click empty cache hard reload. So when we do that, the only way you'll get that menu is if these debugger tools are open. If you try right here, it won't pop up. But if we reopen that, we hard refresh, empty the cache, we'll see that this was printed out on line 8. And then these two were printed out on 31, which again is still this one. So let's get rid of this one so that we're not confused as to what it's doing. If we refresh, we can see just that one. So we saw earlier, we saw a red one. We saw a red console out. So don't worry about what this means. It's basically saying, hey, we couldn't find the icon to stick up here in the top left. So that's not important. But what could be important is, let's say we find that there's an error. So down here, don't worry about what's happening in this function, but down here we're catching an error. So let's say that we want to print out that error in red. And we know that data1.json doesn't exist. So let's go like this. So you can see that here we now have console, what's called console warned in this this right here. Well, warn is yellow. So what we could actually do is we could say, I want you to console error. So these are the different ways of console, using the console. There's also like console table and stuff like that. I guess I could show you a little bit of console table. Let me just refresh that. We'll make sure that everything's working again. Everything's working again. And if we console table out something, you can see we get like a nice little table. So if we're not sure about what each of these actually looks like, this is kind of a nice way that we can put it out there and read it quite easily. If tables make more sense to you than this, then that's totally fine. It's just whatever you prefer. So that's kind of the lazy man's way of doing it. Console logging and console warning and stuff like that. Those are good practices for development, but when we're in a live or production type environment, we don't want lots of these console log messages popping up. So what we could do instead that would really help us is we could take a look at what's actually running inside of our app and instead use breakpoints to figure out what's going on. So let's say we change this back to data.1. We know that's not going to work. So let's refresh it. We know it's not working. We see an error right here. So there's an uncaught exception. So maybe we say, okay, well, we know that the data is being loaded here. So let's take a look and maybe let's put what's called a breakpoint here. And then we can refresh, we can hard reload. So you can see that now our application is paused and it's waiting for us to do something. So if we go to res, we can see that our response is a 404. The file is not found. So rather than console logging over and over again, we can tell right away that this file doesn't exist. And so there's no point in trying to do that. So now you can press the resume and it'll continue on through down the app. If we refresh, it's going to still pause, but now we can look at the res and it's a 200. It's okay. We have the file. Go ahead and resume the script. Now we can see the rest of the output. Let's say, however, something changes in the data. So let's say we change it to something like this now, where we have users as one of our keys and it is an array now of these values. If we now go back to our application, let me go back to it, and we empty cache hard reload, we can see that we're getting lots of weird errors here and we're not quite sure why. So right here we can see that this is telling us what the problem is. So maybe here let's put a breakpoint so that we can see what loaded data actually looks like. So let's refresh. Now we can see that loaded data is an array of users and we pass that in, and each profile here, so maybe let's go ahead and put another one down here. Now we can see it doesn't actually get here because it's failing, because if we refresh, you can see that this isn't an array and we're trying to call an array value, or sorry, an array method on it. But users is the array, not just loaded data. So now we need to go in and change our code. If we go to here, and we can say that this dot, sorry, let me move that, users dot for each. So let's try that and let's refresh. And now we can see that this dot users dot for each, this looks good, but let's put an extra breakpoint there. So it did drop down into it, that's what we expected, and we can see that the profile is that. So that looks good. Let's continue the execution. And we can see that now that it's done it once, it does it twice because there's 2 entries, and away we go. When you're done your debugging, remove your breakpoints, and there you go. So this is just kind of an intro into how to debug simple JavaScript basically JSON objects and rendering issues, things like that. If you're ever not sure what's happening in your JavaScript, put a breakpoint, run through it. If you don't hit that breakpoint, it means you're never getting there. If you do hit it and the data isn't what you expected, then maybe you need to go back to your code and reformat some stuff. Hopefully this was helpful. Hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time.